coming. This is Massachusetts Peace Action, Racial Justice and Decolonization Group, Working Group, the Indigenous Solidarity Subgroup, if that makes any sense. Thank you for all coming. It's nice to see your faces. We had 104 people, or I think the last count was maybe more people that are attending. So it may take a little while to get them on, but we'll start in like 2 minutes. And so welcome everyone. Okay.
So far, we're on time.
Craig, I think you can go ahead and begin the welcome of why we're all here and what made you decide to do this.
Okay, again, thank you all for coming. In Boston, it's a very nice day, but you're all here and we're happy about that. So my name is Craig Simpson. I'm part of the Indigenous subgroup of the Racial Justice and Decolonization Working Group of the Massachusetts Peace Action. So we've done a lot of this in the past. The Racial Justice Committee has had several books. We started originally many years ago. I wasn't even part of the group with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, Indigenous People of the United States. And that's how we started our group. And now it's been many years. And we just recently, about a year ago, did another one called As Long as the Grass Grows by Dina Gilio Whitaker. And that was an excellent book. And then more recently, the working group did How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, and Kevin Peterson came and talked and helped us frame this. And today we have Claudia Fox Tree, who's going to do a similar role, and we're very happy to have her, and she'll be introduced in just a minute. But just a year and a half ago, I returned from Minnesota and was part of the protest at Line 3 for several weeks. And I walked into the Paper Cuts bookstore in Jamaica Plain and saw a copy of the of this book, Not a Nation of Immigrants. And I thought, oh, I got to read that. So that's when I started lobbying for us to do it as a group, because it's such a hard book to challenge ourselves with. So, so you think of all the things that have changed from only a year and a half ago. Most people never didn't hear much about residential schools in Canada or in the US. Many people didn't hear about the term settler colonialism. Many people thought that treaties were a thing of the past, and still do. I'll tell you that in a minute. And many people never heard of land back or the term treaty people. And most of the country hadn't even begun to read Braiding Sweetgrass, but that's one of the most popular books in the United States. So, so today we're working collectively or together on learning this book, which is pretty dense and full of information. And so I hope it's worthwhile. We have two presentations. One is that today.
I'd pick it up from there, Craig, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
You good, Craig?
Go ahead. Here's Bruce. He's going to take it over.
Go ahead, Bruce.
I just wanted to say that we are going to begin our meeting with a land acknowledgement, which has become quite critical to many of us in the movement. Whatever you might mean by the movement, the left, the progressive, the radical, the land back. But the increasingly obvious significance of the indigenous peoples to the movement to restore Earth to balance is the particular leadership and visionary role that they offer, and how important it is for us to understand, adopt, and in some ways, in all ways, support and try to follow. So with that, welcome to our book group.
So, Suzanne Cooper will read our land acknowledgement.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Cooper, and this is the Massachusetts Peace Action Land Acknowledgement. Massachusetts Peace Action respectfully acknowledges that we gather here today on the unceded territories of the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc peoples with Wabanaki Confederacy, Mohican, Nauset, Pawtucket, Pokanoket, Pocumtuck, Mohican Nation Stockbridge Munsee Community, Narragansett, and Pequot overlapping and surrounding, who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. We acknowledge the painful history of the genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. We advocate eliminating Native school mascots, changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, returning remains to families, tribes, and communities, and supporting Native curriculum in all schools. We support land back as part of restoration and environmental justice in Massachusetts and nationwide.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne and Bruce, and especially thank you to Craig, who has been a driving force in the work of our subgroup, our Indigenous Action subgroup, and has been a chief organizer of this book discussion. I'm just going to briefly go over today's agenda. So first, we'll hear from Claudia Fox Tree, and we are delighted that she has agreed to join us. Following her talk and a brief Q&A, we'll be in breakout groups until 4:15. And so that we can hear from others about how the book has affected them and also share our own thoughts. And finally, we'll come back together as a whole group and talk about upcoming opportunities to take action and learn more, including our next book discussion, and we'll end at 4:30.
Okay, do I pick it up from here, Rosalie,
Yes.
or you have?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. It's my turn. I'm happy to go. My name is Erin McCormack. I'm on the Advisory Council of the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness, speaking to you from the shared homelands of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Pennacook Nations, now known as Bedford. I'm happy to introduce our presenter, Claudia Fox Tree, Arawak, who's on the board of the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. I know Claudia as a longtime friend and mother of 5 children who went to school with my children. Over the years, I got to know her as an educator and social justice activist, focused on anti-racism work that includes Indigenous peoples as the earliest targets of oppression and genocide on this land. Learning from her and connecting with other Native people has transformed my life and many others. Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz have written about the mechanics of systemic racism toward all people of color in America. But Claudia suggests beyond the tragedy are centuries of knowledge, prosperity, and beauty of Native peoples and culture, which continue today. As she approaches retirement from public school teaching, she's embarked on a PhD program, aiming to share approaches to educating students and adults alike, blending Native and non-Native ways of knowing, and highlighting significant Indigenous American contributions which have been erased and excluded from popular culture and from the history books. It's my pleasure to welcome Claudia and to say thank you for being with us today. Claudia, you're up.
Tagwe di Tuno, Kena Diatiano, Diri Takina Ru, Claudia Fox Tree, she, her, Uriman, Arawak, Kena, tribal council member of Yukiyaki, Kwainia, Daka, und auch Deutsch Mutterlichseits, Koai Daka Iaha. Greetings, relatives. My name is Claudia Fox Tree, she, her. I'm known as Takina Ru in my Indigenous community, which means woman who leads. My ancestral lineage comes from the island we know as Uriman, and it's in the Caribbean, and I'm a tribal council member of the Guainia Taino tribe. Arawak is sort of the larger group or the language group, and Taino is the cultural group. I want to acknowledge that I am also on traditional, unceded, unsurrendered Pawtucket, Massachusetts, and Agawam territory that you may know as Billerica, Massachusetts, home, and thank you. I did get on early and I assumed everything would work, but I'm not sure that I'm actually going to be able to share slides. Had the this computer memory wiped, spent the morning working on making sure it was working, and didn't have someone to play with on Zoom. So I'll do a quick check, but I think I'm going to have a problem.
Claudia, you could just email it to me and I could show it for you if it doesn't work on your end.
Excellent. Can you put your email in the chat or to me in the chat? And I will share the slides with you and tell you to move forward on them.
It's a backup plan, yeah.
I appreciate that. It's just a few of them that I wanted to get us going on. All right, I'm sending it to you now. Do you have it to share in your screen? And if you can just put it in slide present mode, that'd be great. And it's called Not a Nation of Immigrants.
Haven't spotted it yet, still looking.
Just to check in while Cole is doing this, is somebody else admitting to the waiting room? I think there's a few more people coming in.
Yeah.
Anyone can do it. Anyone.
I have been periodically letting people in from the waiting room as they appear on my screen.
Me as well.
Excellent.
Okay, now I got it, Claudia. Let's just get this.
Okay, because I had a backup plan to try another way in a second. Okay.
Okay, I think this is going to work. Give me one more second here.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
The Zoom world is a world of workarounds.
Okay, so how's that?
Perfect. If you could put it in the slide present mode. I do have a little warning on the first slide because history should just basically have a warning on it. It is hard to read. It's hard to watch. It's hard to learn. And frankly, I think that's part of why we haven't really learned it. Because at what age do you teach this to children? And how much can you be age and stage appropriate for some of these difficult concepts? In fact, recently in school years, the curriculum changed, teaching about slavery from 8th grade to 5th grade. Now, how much of a better job can you do talking about people who were enslaved at 5th grade with 5th grade level minds than you can at 8th grade? And so if we're teaching Indigenous people at 4th grades and it involves an attempted genocide, that, like, how much can you actually teach that's the whole truth? So it's really problematic that history is moved to grades where you can't really teach the whole story, and then the whole story doesn't get taught, and then you go to things like this and then you learn parts of it. And frankly, I have kids in 7th grade who are like, why weren't we told the truth? It's like we were lied to. Why should they trust school? It's just really challenging. So we'll move to the next slide. There's my warning if you need to, like, take deep breaths or close your eyes for a second. That's what you need to do. I wanted to kind of show a thing about language. Part of my focus will be on language. I like to use language because language is something that we all control as an individual. We can start using different words, thinking about our language and using our language for activism immediately. And while I still think everything else that is really important, doing political things, doing protests, doing education, all of that is important. As an individual, in the next second, we can watch our language. And on this particular side, the black and white has the original names of the islands, and the color one has the current names of the islands. And that piece of erasing Indigenous people started with renaming the lands. If you look at some of the maps that are used in school, they literally have, like, the names of the states from moving to the right to moving to the left as land was taken away, being renamed, and the other lands still have Indigenous names. And as the further west you go, the less you have the names of the Indigenous people. And Indigenous people named the territory after the territory. So the Winding River might be a name in an Indigenous language of a river, or the land of mountains, aka Massachusetts. So in some places the name has stayed, but in other places, Charles River, it has not stayed. And so when we erase the Indigenous names, we also erase the meaning and the way that those natural things behaved and lived and acted as our relatives in our communities. Now it's a foreigner's name that often didn't visit here, wasn't born here. Speaking of foreign, every single language that is on these continents is a foreign language, except for the Indigenous languages. And every Indigenous person is forced to learn a colonizer language. So in the North and South American continents, or what we know of as North and South America, we have Portuguese and Spanish and French and English and even Dutch, if you include, like, other areas. And I don't think I might be missing something, but we're all speaking colonizer languages as our first or second language, and the Indigenous languages are their least one. Now, my ongoing narrative throughout this little short presentation and my life's work is that there is no other place in the world where Indigenous people's story needs to be told, if not here on the land, which is their Indigenous lands. I can't go to Germany and say, why aren't you teaching about the Indigenous people of North and South America? Or Spain, you should be teaching about the natives of the United States. That would be ludicrous. However, we are here in a place that is the land of Indigenous people. And so I can say and expect, and even expect it to be prioritized, because there is no other place. And every single other true immigrant or migrant or colonizer to this land has another land where their stories, their people, their language, their history, their artists, musicians, and books already exist. And we don't. So it needs to happen here. And that is an important job of all of us as allies. And I consider myself as an ally to the indigenous people of the continental United States, because that also is not where my nation is from. So the work that I do is about being an ally right now, mostly to the people of the lands who I'm on, like the Massachusetts and Wampanoag and Nipmuc, and even going into Maine, Penobscot. So these are all really important pieces of how we use the land, how we use our voice. So on the next slide, I have, that's a cue to move to, thank you. I wanted to start off with a few statistics. So Mantika Wilbur did research while she was doing her doctoral studies over this 10-year time period from 1990 to 2000. And she researched blockbuster films. She's actually a photographer. She has beautiful photography. She's from this area, Brown University, Connecticut, that kind of thing. She has a great podcast that she does, All My Relations, with some other folks. They come and go depending on which season you're listening to, and it's a great way to get information. She did her research looking at blockbuster films. She wasn't looking at every single film around, just the blockbusters. And she looked at about 6,000 of them over this time period. Again, we're talking about the United States, where indigenous people are from. And I am curious, you can put it in the chat, how many do you think included Native Americans? How many films of the 6,000 filmed on the land of the indigenous people included indigenous people in them? Blockbusters over the 90s, from that decade. So I can see that we got 15, 5, 12, 20. Thank you for playing my chat game. 50, 12. So the answer is that there were 12. And if you see my presentations, you might know that, and you might have had a lucky guess. Of those 12, all of them showed Native Americans as spiritual and tuned with nature. And while that's true, that's a stereotype when it gets applied to everyone. 10 showed Native Americans impoverished or beaten down by society. 10 showed continually in conflict with whites, which is probably true. I mean, how you define conflict, there's always going to be some conflict going on because this is indigenous land and there is hardly any representation, especially on the East Coast. It's interesting to note that Reclaiming Native Truth, who I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, also looked at characters in 345 of the most popular television shows that aired sort of the same time period, 87 to 2007. And of the 2,336 characters, only 3 were Native Americans. Now, I don't have statistics for Canada, so I only have these statistics of what happened in the United States. So 3 had Native American characters. But I went to Canada this year, and I was watching the TV and seeing what was going on. And just in my 1 week of watching television currently in Canada, there were Native American people on every show, including like Iron Chef and commercials. It visibly has Native people as representation. And so Canada is doing it, but the United States has not quite caught up to that. Next slide. Other statistics. Pause. John Sanchez did some research as well. He's at the University of Pennsylvania over that same time period as Mantika Wilbur, and he looked at the big 3, ABC, CBS, NBC. Now, this number is bigger than 12. So he reviewed 175,889 news reports. How many of those do you think included Native Americans? So this is the news. It is more than 12. There are certain times a year when news reports happen. It typically isn't that there's, like crime or fires or other kind of tragedies that are happening. I mean, even the protests are not hugely advertised. Who would want to advertise Native Americans complaining on the news? I call it advertisement, but it's like that makes the news, right? The Dakota Access Pipeline had to be huge before it made the news. But there's more. So write in the chat how many you think included. So we have 350, 175, 200. How many news reports had Native Americans? The answer is 98. So not even 100 news reports during this 10-year time period. It turns out that a majority of the news reports, they're not about those things that I said they weren't about. They are usually about like Thanksgiving or Columbus Day or something like that. And they include 18th century imagery. So like horses and buckskins and headdresses. Maybe there's some protests at a football game and that hits the news. So basically, there isn't a lot of representation at all of stories of actual Indigenous people. What's happening in a crisis, like the COVID crisis was huge in the Indigenous community. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, the first show in recent times that's been addressing that issue is Alaska Daily. Somebody can put in the chat, Hilary Swank is the lead actress in that, and that it's a series, it's completely about missing murdered Indigenous women. I highly recommend it, even though it's still in progress. I don't know how it's going to end, but the first 3 episodes are great. So there isn't a lot of information. And here's the thing, implicit bias, the biases like internalizing those stereotypes and using words or thinking things about images or not noticing that it's even missing from news reports or missing from cartoon characters or missing from films, that kind of bias is reinforced when all we get is secondhand knowledge. So we get knowledge from teachers or from books or from films and from other places. And if we're not getting it, then we're not getting any knowledge. We're not getting any knowledge. But secondhand knowledge is secondhand. When we make relationships with Indigenous people by going to events, by going to speaker series, by talking to people, we get firsthand knowledge. When we go to the places, and visit the sites, that firsthand knowledge is a very different knowledge, and it is where you're going to build relationships. You can't build a relationship with a human being with a book, just you and the book. You can when you all get together and talk about the book. You can't get it from just watching a film. To build relationships with Indigenous people, you need to relate to Indigenous people. You need to build those connections. Powwows are a great place to start, if I hadn't said that. There are other ways besides secondhand knowledge that are better for building the relationship. And once you have the relationship, you look at those stereotypes differently. You're like, well, I know people and they're not like that. Or I know people and this is missing, or this is how they're treated. So it's important for us to expand our network of understanding with real firsthand examples. So next slide. You may have to click this a couple of times. So after I say each sentence, just so first, Reclaiming Native Truth did a 2-year study, and they looked at 28 focus groups in 11 states. They surveyed 13,000, more than that, people. They analyzed 5 million social media posts. They interviewed members of Congress, judges, as well as philanthropy, business, and other leaders. So this was a huge study, and they found that representation of Native Americans is almost completely absent in K-12 education, pop culture, news, media, and politics, which is basically what we just saw with some other research. Next number, 62% of the US non-Native Americans report. So just keep clicking on this slide and the other ones, thank you. Report not knowing a single Native American person. Now, people who live more west have more exposure to Native American people. Well, there's more tribal nations. There's just multiple reasons why there's more exposure. But here on the East Coast, even though there's thousands of people, many report not knowing a single one. Only 13, next number, number 3, only 13% of history curriculum standards show events after 1900. This is really important because that's missing a whole ton of stuff. It's missing when Native Americans became US citizens. It's missing when Native Americans got the right to have freedom of religion. It's missing when boarding schools happened and when they ended. It's missing the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's missing all contemporary issues and contributions, whether it was through music or food or any other kind of way, when there is nothing after 1900. Number 4, even though the country had 400 boarding schools, only 4 states teach the history: Arizona, Washington, Oklahoma, and Kansas. So notice that does not include Massachusetts. And boarding schools, took children thousands of miles away. So even if your state, like Massachusetts, did not have a boarding school, that doesn't mean they didn't participate, because there were definitely Indigenous people from Massachusetts sent to boarding schools. They were just in other states. And number 5, the depiction of contemporary Native Americans is so rare that a 2015 report said 95 of the first 100 Google images are historical representations. Now I'm going to say what I said again. I said I was going to say this over and over, is that we have no other place. There's no other place in the world that has accurate Indigenous representation if it is not here in the United States, and it's not. And that's a real problem, that there's no accurate representation of Indigenous people on Indigenous land. Next slide. So I want to say a little more about industrial boarding schools, because it is a huge part of the history, and it is a recent part of the history. So it is really important to think about in terms of current historical trauma, because Indigenous people had siblings, themselves, parents, children who were in industrial boarding schools. They didn't end here until 1978, which is my generation. I was in middle school. In Canada, they didn't end until 1996, which is my children's generation. This isn't like a century ago. This is really current. And so this is visiting the boarding schools. A couple of years ago, I went to the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, which is in Pennsylvania. It was the first industrial school. And I'm going to just say one thing about schools. Never, ever should a school where children are sent have a cemetery attached to it. That's just wrong. And because of the violence and abuse, many children died at these boarding schools. This photograph that I took, you can see the dry grass. That's where children's remains were removed, because the Lakota, this was a month after I visited, and a month before, the remains had been taken out of the land and brought back to the Lakota Sioux, who had asked for their children to be returned, and they were reinterred into the Lakota lands. So it is actively still an issue for Indigenous people. And this is just the remains and bones of their children, but it doesn't even include the other fights for ancestors who are in museums, for spiritual, religious, and ceremonial objects that were taken and put into museums or private collections. Access to paths that go to particular sacred sites or burial grounds, or even hunting and fishing rights. So there's many, many things that Indigenous people are fighting for, and these are just some of the things. Hit a couple times, because there's some notes on that slide, and then sorry you didn't get to see that. I didn't notice.
Oh yeah.
There's the dried out grass, right? All right, next slide, but there might be a word. This was what Richard Pratt said. In all the Indian, there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So that's his, he's got a shorter expression, but that's the actual quote. So in Canada, they did a lot of reparations there. One of the things they did was raise this pole at Vancouver at the University of British Columbia, BC. And you can see the children in the school at the top of the pole. And it was one part of their reparations. Other things they do is, like, museums are free to all Indigenous people. Some who want to be with their ancestors or ceremonial objects have to make appointments for, like, seeing it if it's like behind the scenes, but they're working on it. It's not where it should be, but they're working on it. I want to give some time for questions. So I'm going to just stop the slides now, if you don't mind, and we'll go back to full screen. And that way I can answer anything that people might have come up already with the boarding schools after I make a closing comment, which is that one of the things that we can do, which I mentioned before, was use our words. So, what can we do? We can make sure we connect to the land, which you do when you tribal land acknowledgements. We can actively do some reparations. Maybe it's through political means, but maybe we realize we have some artifacts and we need to return it to the people, or we have access to the land that has something on it. I mean, there's other things that happen for reparations. We need to hold ourselves accountable, and we can use our words. We can use our words in our tribal land acknowledgements. We can use them to be aware when there might be a microaggression or an expression like low man on the totem pole, like second guess that and realize that that's probably not the accurate use of the words. We can use words to interrupt stereotypes, and we connect our words to decolonizing contributions. So for example, when we're sitting around and we're having corn and we're like, we should thank Indigenous people because we have corn, because most of us realize that corn is something that's Indigenous. We can also decolonize that and say, and corn was not found out in a field or forest just the way it is now as a long stalk with a cob on the end of it. It was a grass. It was a little grass. It had something at the top that was edible, and it was engineered with technology and genetics to be that big corn stalk. So Indigenous people had a lot of Indigenous knowledge of the plants, the animals, the climates, everything around here. And we have all benefited, not just by the fact that we're eating corn, but by the fact that Indigenous people were really knowledgeable, smart, ingenious in developing all kinds of foods, techniques, and shelters, just many, many things that we now benefit from. All right, I'm open to question. You can put them in the chat, or you can grab one of the speakers, or if you've sent something to them.
Sure. Go ahead. Deb has a question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for that context. That was really great. I'm just wondering if, just in your comparisons with Canada and, the amount of reparations and acknowledgement they've done, what are your thoughts on why the US, is not there yet in comparison to other countries?
I have a lot of thoughts about this. Here are a few things to think about. One is that the US didn't want to sign the agreements at the UN that included genocide against their populations. Other countries signed it for theirs, and they're making amends, and the US did not do that. So they don't really want to acknowledge what they did. I can't remember the name of the document, but they didn't sign it. The other thing is that, once you acknowledge it, you actually have to do stuff. And it's hard to consider what it is. And if it comes down to land, the US does not want to give any land back. In fact, they're really working hard to keep the land and take more of it through other kinds of policies that are happening now that I didn't get into, but also have to do with boarding schools. And another thing is that there has been a louder voice with and other groups and their allies about the slavery movements and reparations for slavery than there has been for Indigenous people. And that needs to happen too. And when the voice is louder, Indigenous people aren't heard. And I'm going to say it again, Indigenous people have nowhere else in the world where their voice should be heard and highlighted except their own lands.
Thank you.
Maybe one, we're running a little behind time. So
One more question?
yeah, but keep putting him.
I'm not seeing any of the questions, so you're just going to have to tell me if you have any others.
Rosalie.
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of thinking about what you've been saying about the difference between US and Canada. And I wonder if part of it has to do with the whole slavery issue here, that maybe there's a feeling that we were opening up a Pandora's box. If we think about reparations for Native Americans, then what about reparations for Black people? And so that in a way, those two things maybe are very tied together in people's minds and make it more difficult.
Well, it absolutely is tied together because Indigenous people were enslaved as well.
Right.
I mean, and there is intersectionality all over the place with the Black experience, and it is not the same experience. It is very different what happened to Indigenous people in terms of their entire culture, survival, and land being taken, and no place else in the world. So while I agree it is important to do both, I'm always going to advocate and highlight the people whose land you're actually on, who have no other place in the world for it to be happening.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Claudia. We really appreciate you being here today. So we're going to move ahead and get into small groups, and Claire is going to help us with guidelines that we have in these small groups. And thank you again, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And very briefly, I think our goals for the small groups are to listen actively and respectfully to each other, and to take turns, basically step up, step back, and share airtime. If everyone who has, we want to make sure everyone who wants to speak has a turn, at least one turn, before someone who has spoken speaks again. Essentially keeping comments to 1 to 1.5 minutes is our goal. And I know it's not easy because a lot of times we struggle to express ourselves. And raising hands is helpful because that way we don't have as much cacophony going on. So
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's never long enough, is it? Erin, do you want to pull us together here?
Sure thing. Are we all back? We all ready?
Yes, everyone's back.
Okay, let me begin. To conclude, I'm going to conclude with a few thoughts on today's event, followed by announcements and upcoming events from Craig, my co-moderator. First off, I do need to thank MAPPA for hosting the event and inviting me to collaborate as part of the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. It has been a pleasure working with this group. I want to thank Craig himself for initiating the discussion of this book. It truly was his discovery and his push to get it out here and for us to gather and talk about it, because it's not an easy book. He recognized its importance, brought people together to take action, including Rosalie Anders, Suzanne Cooper, Bruce Taub, and myself. We got assistance from Cole Harrison and some of the other MAPPA members. Thank you all for taking this on. Thanks are also due to everyone here on Zoom, those that read the book and showed up to talk about it. In my opinion, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has accomplished an amazing feat to gather all this information and to offer this level of analysis about the society we live in. But it is not easy to read about. To accept the assertion that America has evolved as a fiscal military state that achieved world dominance, not simply by the hard work of grateful immigrants, but primarily on the violent appropriation of land and labor of brown people, is a terrible loss of innocence. This new knowledge and way of looking at things can feel like a burden. Now what do we do? Fortunately, the problem is not ours alone to fix. There are others engaged in the struggle for better truths and different ways of doing things. There are Native American and Black leaders who have found a platform for their messages and audiences ready to hear them. After we educate ourselves, we can join groups already doing the work, which is a very energizing experience and may bring us into contact with Indigenous people and people of color who we might not otherwise share space with. I have relished my relationships with Native people through the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness, starting as a volunteer at powwows, asking what needed to be done. Over the course of 10, 12 years, I showed up, they got to know me, I got to know them. They asked me to be on the advisory council, and I said yes. I was ready and they were ready. To me, only relationships can build trust, and only trust can make for good, true collaborations, which can make for real change. Sometimes I ask myself, now that I know what I know, do I really have a choice? To borrow from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Three Magi, I am no longer at ease in the old dispensation. That is how things used to be, the old, the familiar. But I see the makings of a better world, and I want to be part of that. And hopefully you do too. So here's some opportunities. Back to Craig to tell some of the things that are going on. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. That was great. So I'd like to see all your faces, not just mine, but thank you all for coming, but we still have 4 more chapters. You have a month to read them. So I really hope that you'll be coming to the next one, because we have 2 excellent people that have joined us. Heather Levette from the Italians for Indigenous Peoples Day. She's around here somewhere. And also Andres Maris Moro originally from El Paso, who will help us frame some of these questions that we come up in the book, in the chapters 5 through 8, which is about the immigration cycles of various groups. So I hope you can be part of that. So also, we're promoting we hope that you'll be able to participate in the National Day of Mourning in Plymouth, Massachusetts at 12 noon at Coles Hill in Plymouth, to join that as well. And there are plenty of groups around Massachusetts to be involved in this and throughout the country. Supporting United American Indians of New England and the National North American Center for
American Indian Center of Boston.
Yeah, there you go. You got me nervous here. Okay, so I hope that you'll be able to come to those things. There's in the future, there'll be harbor tours by the Massachusetts tribe, which is going on today. I'm sorry to let you down, but yeah, that's so there's so many things going on and ways to participate and meeting people from the various tribes. You can contact the Native Land Conservancy, which is down in Mashpee, working with issues and other things. So, and then of course, the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. In the last session, we've had 5 bills. None of them got through the State House, but we're still working on those bills. And we appreciate that we want to mobilize more as time goes on. So there are issues around Indigenous Peoples Day, Native curriculum in all the public schools, returning artifacts and remains to tribal leaders and tribal nations, and much more. So there's a lot ways you can tune in and be part of. So we hope you'll stay with us till November 19th. And we're going to try to present a more thorough coverage of some of these issues brought up by Roxanne. I think I've covered most of that. My
Hey, Craig, do you mind my jumping in here and asking?
Jump,
We have
jump.
5 or 6 minutes left, which is unusual for running a conference, although not necessarily for a book group. But I know we've talked in individual groups and decided not to do report back. But if there's somebody who's not of the core group who would like to reflect on this, or anybody, we're really eager to hear from other people. We've been talking about this a lot. So if that's one option for 5 minutes, I offer it.
Bruce, you've got
We
a
have-
hand from Nancy Milken. Would you like to hear from Nancy?
Yeah.
Whoever is moderating, I can't do that in the car.
Okay,
Okay.
go ahead, Nancy.
Hi. I just wanted to add a question. Is there any progress on changing the Massachusetts flag? I work at a state building and every time I see it, I cringe.
Thank you for that question. There's a commission already formed and working on it. They're supposed to end before the end of the final session in January, but they might extend themselves till March. So they have 5 Indigenous people on that commission. They've been hashing out all kinds of things. I'm pretty positive there'll be changes. I don't know what, how they're going to come to consensus, but they seem pretty good at challenging a lot of the myths and moving forward. So we have to kind of, doesn't mean you can't speak out about it and write about it. I think.
Thank you for the update. I appreciate it.
Well, could you open it up to all the gallery so we can see each other?
I'm looking at gallery. You may have to adjust your own view, Craig, if you're not seeing that.
Oh, okay.
Would anyone else
There we
like
go.
to offer?
If you
Oh,
go up
yeah.
in the corner, it says view, do gallery, and that'll work.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So maybe Heather is here. She might say something about the next thing or what she's been thinking about reporting on November 9th.
Sure. Well, I did have a thought about the flag too, Nancy. I feel like if you see folks hanging the flag, you should say something if it's within your comfort zone. I went to the Museum of Fine Arts to see the Obama portraits a few weeks ago, and they have this whole new visual identity where they have a huge banner, "Everyone is welcome here," hanging on the Huntington's Ave entrance, right? And then there's the flag, what flag? The American flag on one side of the facade and the Commonwealth flag on the other side of the facade. And I was just so disgusted. And this is an institution that has been trying to cultivate relationships and trust among Indigenous artists and leadership. And I consulted with United American Indians of New England and wrote to the curators and didn't hear back for a couple weeks, and finally heard back the day before Indigenous Peoples Day, and they said they were taking it down that day. They weren't sure if it was going to stay down. So it may be back up. But I feel like if we say something, even though the flag is taking a while to change, there's been plenty of public discourse around the inappropriateness of it that I think we can say something. I was like, do I have to stand by or should I say something? And it ended up being a half good. They took it down for the day. Sounded like they were going to be putting it back up because there's a lot of discussion apparently that's involved. I don't know why, but because it is just infuriating every time I see that thing hanging. But yeah, so anyway, that's just what I wanted to add. And next time we meet, I will talk a little bit about, I'm a co-founder of Italian Americans for Indigenous Peoples Day, and we support statewide legislation changing the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and talk a little bit about my impressions of the second part of the book and some of the work that we do.
Great, thank you.
I see Andres here. You're in an airport.
Yeah, I'm at Newark Airport. I just flew in. Folks, I want to let you know that I've known this troublemaker since about the 80s, so there was no way that I could resist the invitation.
What are you thinking about the book?
I was telling the group of people that I was with right now that I'm on chapter 7, and I feel like I'm ripping through it because it's just very interesting how she's kind of painting a portrait of the United States, and just the citations. You know, I've been reading in this last chapter about Teddy Roosevelt and his connection with eugenics and white supremacy. It's just amazing. And also how the Italians were indigenized, how the Irish were indigenized. It's just, I respect her a lot. I've heard her speak twice over the years. I had a little bit of a reaction. I came in late to Claudia. There's a part of me that doesn't really care what images people have of natives as long as they make restitution. Like it's like you can call me whatever you want, just call me to the table.
Thanks, Andres. Okay, any other comments before we head off into our lives? Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
For
November
showing
19th.
up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening.